All right, everybody, we're going to get started here. Thanks for showing up today. We've got a good talk today, Protecting Animals Within and Across Borders, with Charlotte Blattner, who is one of our visiting researchers here at the Animal Law and Policy Program. And Professor Stilt is going to interview, who's the faculty director of the Animal Law and Policy Program, is going to kind of, after a short presentation, engage Charlotte in a conversation about some of these issues. One thing I want to point out, on Wednesday, we will be having Jonathan Loveborn come do a couple events. He's going to be giving a lunchtime lecture in B010, and then doing a coffee at noon, and then doing a coffee chat at 3:30 in another. You can go to either to the ALPP website. Okay. 3015 is a coffee chat at 3:30. And Jonathan Loveborn has taught several of our courses here, both our wildlife law course and our farmed animal law and policy course. But with that, I will turn it over to Professor Stilt.
All right, thank you, Chris, for introducing us. And I'm very happy to be conversing with Charlotte over this really magnificent book. And there's a lot to cover here. And I think our goal is that you want to dig deeper into the book as a result of our conversation. We're not starting from the assumption that you've already read the book, and we're here to discuss it with that, assuming that background. So I think Charlotte's going to start with a few minutes of just laying the foundation, and then we'll have a conversation about it.
Excellent.
Great.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very good.
Better now?
That's great.
Perfect. So again, thank you so much for the kind introduction. And I first want to express my gratitude to you, Chris, Professor Kristen Stilt, and the entire Animal Law and Policy Program for hosting the event and for having me as a visiting researcher. Being part of the program and having been able to watch the program grow has been magnificent. Be it like your moving to the new office space or the ever-growing number of very competent and creative people has been a sheer joy. So thank you so much for letting me be part of it.
Well, thanks for being with us.
So I began my own journey like many of you do probably now, studying law in the hopes that this would open up many career options, secure a safe income, and more importantly to me, and hopefully to many of you too, contribute to making the world a better place for animals. I began to read a couple of papers and books, attended a few conferences here and there, and listened to the concerns that scholars raised. I then turned to the numbers. I began to see that the manufacture and consumption of animal products has literally exploded within the last decades. So we can see this here at the development of meat supply per person on a global scale from 1961 to 2013. Beef red are the states that consume the most. The same is true when it comes to the production and consumption of dairy. Here also from 1961 to 2013. So to meet this rising demand for animal products, there is a vast complex of multi-billion-dollar industries that now produce animal products, not locally within the confines of each state, but globally. Between 1986 and 2016, the world population doubled, but trade in eggs, meat, and dairy increased threefold. As a result, there is now a dense web of economic activities in breeding, cage systems, feed, veterinary practices, technologies, slaughter, packaging, and distribution. Corporations mainly owe duties to their shareholders, so they're prone to using free market and global markets to further their financial interests. So for example, pigs are moved across borders so companies can profit from cheap slaughter. Fish cages are relocated across territorial seas to evade regulation. Sheep are transported by the millions so producers can benefit from business-friendly climate. And so are cows. And finally, monkeys are relocated so breeders and research institutions are not burdened by regulatory requirements. These entwined economic activities have led states to compete with each other in order to attract and retain manufacturers and investors. And they do so not by increasing, but by lowering their standards of animal law. In this regulatory competition, the state with the lowest standards wins simply because it attracts most capital. This race to the bottom is a common phenomenon in the context of labor, environmental protection, human rights law, etc. But as I show in the book, it also is at work in animal law. Now, the race to the bottom has serious consequences for states within their borders because it undermines their efforts to enact or uphold laws that protect animals, even on their domestic territory. For instance, the US in 2006 prohibited governmental funding for federal inspectors of horse meat. Without inspectors, the institutions that slaughter horses cannot legally run their business. So the funding ban effectively resulted in a ban on horse slaughter. A year later, in reaction to the ban, the number of exports of horse slaughter to Mexico increased by 312%. In other words, the entire horse slaughter industry was effectively outsourced to Mexico. Now, because of this, more and more people wanted the ban to be reversed, even those advocating for horse slaughter. Their main claim was that US laws intended to protect animals have not helped, but actually failed animals, precisely because of globalization. These dynamics, as I look at it in the book, are practically ubiquitous across the world, especially when it comes to commercially used animals. Be it efforts to ban research on animals, calls for bigger or no cages, or bans on male chick shredding. States find it unnecessary, even counterproductive, to enact stricter laws if borders remain open. This is detrimental because the lowest level of animal law anywhere in the world ends up defining and anchoring all global efforts to protect animals. My first hunch was actually that we could solve this problem simply by setting up an international treaty. Since there's no international treaty that is currently in force that expresses a uniform commitment of states to recognize animal sentence, to prohibit cruelty against animals, to prevent their suffering, demand humane treatment, or actually lay down robust rights for animals, we simply need to create just that. But as I dug deeper, I began to realize that concluding a treaty is first unlikely and second unhelpful. Agreement is unlikely because producers and consumers are unevenly distributed in the world. So some states will always want to underregulate while others will tend to overregulate. Agreement is also unhelpful because it tends to converge to the lowest common denominator, and as such will undermine efforts to increase the global level of animal law. This is, in essence, a prisoner's dilemma. States could reap great benefits if they cooperated on matters of animal law, but they refuse to do it or fail to do it because they find it difficult or expensive or because they are afraid of free riders. So what's the way out? In the book, I explore the law of jurisdiction as a tool to change the dynamics of animal law for the better, both nationally and globally. Two tasks lay at the heart of this book. The first was to gain legal certainty about how states could protect animals better within their border in cases where there is a wealth of cross-border relationships. The second task was to explore reasonable ways for states to protect animals across the border. So one central hypothesis of the book was that the factual entanglement of people, property, and commerce cannot be sorted out if we rely on states to meticulously apply their animal laws on domestic territory. Factual entanglement, in other words, calls for legal entanglement, and that is extraterritorial jurisdiction. Extraterritorial jurisdiction is, as I use it in the book, a state's power to prescribe its own laws across the border to people, events, or property situated thereon. It can be indirect in nature, or it can be direct. And by the way, there's no need to understand the structure right now. We might come back to this in our conversation. So under international law, for example, direct extraterritorial jurisdiction can be exercised by states by invoking so-called jurisdictional principles. For example, the active personality principle gives states jurisdiction over their natural and legal persons, or nationals, wherever they are. So I, for example, I'm a Swiss national, but I reside in the US. If I commit treason, engage in subversive propaganda, or commit human trafficking, Switzerland will and can exercise jurisdiction over me. The same can be done in animal law. Anyone engaging in, for example, illegal trophy hunting abroad can, at least under international law, be subjected to their home state jurisdiction. And this principle, I think, is very useful when we apply it to corporations, for example. So you can use the active personality principle to cover actions of corporations abroad, foreign branches, and under certain circumstances, even foreign subsidiaries. So in some, extraterritorial jurisdiction is widely used in criminal law, commerce, banking, antitrust, and human rights law, where it basically revolutionized the entire field. Similarly, I believe it can and must play a key role in triggering better protections for animals. So this is just a brief overview of what motivations drive the book and what its main goals are. I'm more than excited to now begin a conversation with Professor Stilt about international actions, the use of animals, and the role of law in it. Those of you who have taken animal law with her last spring knows that she is a tremendous expert on all matters of international and comparative animal law, and she has rich expertise in the field when it comes to live animal experts. So I'm very, very thankful to her and more than thrilled to have this conversation with her.
We're thankful for you for writing this book. So let's just dig in a little deeper on some of the fundamentals that underlie the book. So the subtitle, Extraterritorial Jurisdiction and the Challenges of Globalization. Can you say a little more about where globalization fits in? Is it about the increased consumption, which you've shown us? But it's about more than that, right? What does globalization mean for you, and what does it mean for the protection of animals? What is the challenge that globalization confronts us with?
Well, globalization, one extent of it, as you mentioned, was that we have, many more people on this planet than when most of the states actually enacted their animal law. The U.S., I believe, with the Animal Welfare Act in 1966. So there are more challenges to that right now as more people consume animal products. But a main problem with globalization is that the production simply moves to the states where the lowest standards prevail. And the problem with that is corporations, especially multinationals, have so much economic power that states actually try to, attract their attention and have them within their own countries because they're, to them, valuable taxpayers. So states actually often bow to these economic powers. If you think about multinationals, some have, more revenues than some states have, some states' GDP. So they have tremendous leveraging power in negotiating actually laws or forcing states to create an environment that is conducive to corporations. So
to give an example, so we're talking about factory farming in the U.S. on the decline because factory farming in other jurisdictions with even less legal infrastructure than us is more attractive. Give us some examples of what this looks like.
Yeah. So in the book I use 4 cases that I kind of want to see whether what I propose actually plays out. So I look at outsourcing as one example, and that's mainly the case when it comes to animals who are used in agriculture or in research. Then we have trophy hunting as a way in which individuals use or exploit animal law abroad to kind of profit from lax regulations and engage in the activities that might be or often are prohibited in their home states. I look at migration as another example, and trade more generally. So let's take illegal trophy hunting as an example. So a U.S. national, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, made the headlines as he killed Cecil the lion in Zimbabwe. And everyone was destroyed to hear about this because Cecil played an important role he was claimed to contribute to ecosystem services. He played an important part in the community, was part of a field study, an important one to study movement of lions and their role in the broader community. So he was shot, and the way he was shot, he was kind of lured out of the canned hunting environment that he was in. Anyway, scholars proposed quite creative ways of how to tackle the situation. For example, by using private international law, certain elements of trade law. But In fact, I believe, at least under international law, there's a much more direct and kind of immediate way to do that. Namely, he was a U.S. national, so technically, if U.S. laws were, if U.S. Congress decided to do that, it could actually apply animal law to this person who was legally hunting abroad.
Okay, so the globalization angle is more people traveling to do things that are not permissible in their own country.
And there's corporate elements to that, there's actions of individual people to that, there's the trade element to that, trade in products or live animals as well. So yeah, many dimensions that it tries to cover.
Okay, so let's talk about this proposal you just had of having U.S. law apply to the hunter. So let's take a step back and ask ourselves, how likely is that U.S. legal system, our government would enact such a law? And I think maybe to answer that, could you give us a sense of when do we see that? You mentioned, the Swiss law on terrorism, but can you give us some examples from the U.S. perspective of when do we impose our law upon the actions outside the borders?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the U.S. is, interestingly enough, well known internationally to be really aggressive when it comes to applying laws extraterritorially, even enforcing them on foreign territory. And I'm not even talking about this dimension in the book, right? I'm only talking about ways in which states can apply laws extraterritorially. So the US did that in the 1960s and 70s quite aggressively when it came to antitrust law. And there were huge international disputes as to, would that be legitimate, how and why does it potentially violate principles of international law or, territorial integrity of other states. And the U.S. Has developed principles of how to do that, the principle of reasonableness and comity, etc., to deal with that. But it's an interesting question to ask, why has it not done so in other areas? It's quite restrictive when it comes to labor laws, for example. It's restrictive when it comes to environmental protection. ESA is one example of those. And it will also be when it comes to animal laws. So the book, and that is a notable limitation of it, mainly looks at this from an international perspective. As to say, from international law perspective, this is totally legal. What you as domestic legislator do, this is up to you and has to be part of a democratic conversation within the state. International law does not, at least yet under international law, oblige states to protect animals across the border. It does so when it comes to human rights law, for example, right now, but not when it comes to animals.
So you give some examples from criminal law, for example. Maybe say a little more about that to give us more context. When would it be the case that an American citizen, so I'm trying to sort of kind of analogize our best case scenario, right? What's the best case we can make to extend American law outside the territory or any other law outside of the territory to protect animals? In the American case, give us an example of maybe criminal law, times in which if you commit a crime outside the U.S., you're still liable under U.S. law.
Yeah, for example, if, I don't know how the case is exactly under U.S. American law, but most states do in fact criminalize their nationals if they go abroad, move or reside there, and, for example, engage in human trafficking, or they engage in pedophile actions, for example. Then the home state jurisdiction will apply those laws no matter whether it's legal or illegal in the state in which those actions have taken place. And so criminal law is very useful when it comes to individual actions. Less so, but increasingly more when it comes to corporate actions because of corporate criminal liability, which is on the rise internationally.
So what's the gap between these examples you've given us, antitrust, maybe on the corporate level, or engaging in sex trafficking on the individual level, and protection of animals? How far is the gap between those? What do we need to do to get this closer to the examples the successful examples that you've given?
Yeah.
Do you see that as a possibility?
Yeah, definitely. I think there are lots of gaps. In a sense, the scheme that I established could be applied today, right? Every state could just, where there is a reasonable link between it and the state of facts abroad, it could just apply those laws extraterritorially. The question is it useful and will it do so? I believe in the US that has comparatively very low standards of animal law, applying it extraterritorially will not be very helpful, or in the worst case, it will actually be used to oppress minorities. So you have a fantastic piece on, protections of cows in India are not actually about cows, and they're not actually about protections, right? So many animal laws, as they today exist, are at a very, very low standard. I have quite some critical views in the book about this, and I think applying this across the border prematurely will not be useful. So at worst, it will oppress minorities, and it will just claim that the U.S. ways of how we raise or slaughter animals will simply be imposed upon other people without actually helping the animals.
So but let's be clear, from a U.S. perspective, that would only happen if there was a nexus to the U.S., right? If we had an American citizen or a corporation domiciled in the U.S., those are the entities or the individuals that the extraterritorial application would apply to.
Those are two examples,
Mm-hmm.
and that's this is the personality principles, but there's many more. An effect principle is another example in which this could be done. So actions abroad that have an effect within the
Done
U.S.
by anyone.
No, they have to be substantial. There's requirements as to what the nature of those effects have to be. There has to be a certain threshold that has to be met.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one example. Then there's the universality principle. So for example, acts that are so egregious that they shock the world community. We know that from many acts that are committed against humans, but the same could be invoked also when it comes to animals under certain circumstances.
But just to be clear, we're talking about potentially one country attempting to regulate the actions everywhere else in the world, whether done by their own citizens or not.
When it comes to the effects
When the-
or universality
Yes.
principle,
Mhm.
yes, those can be quite excessive, and I put up some safety measures to ensure that this is not, does not go overboard. But there's a certain duty. I believe there's also a danger in not doing anything as we do right now, because most states are quite, they're as soon as one cross-border relationship is included in any state of facts, they have a hands-off approach. They're we don't know what to do with this, because our animal welfare acts do not delimit the territorial scope.
Mm-hmm.
So we have no idea what to do, and most often they just simply claim, oh, this would violate international law, and that's where the book kicks in.
To show that you have the power,
Yeah.
right?
It's
Okay.
not the case.
So let's come back around to what are the negative potential effects that you mentioned.
Yeah.
But just as a practical matter, how do we get from here to there? How do we get countries, maybe the countries with the best laws, to start to think about extraterritorial application? What are the political impediments to doing that?
Political impediments, I believe one of the biggest ones is, or positively formulated, there's a need to educate a lot of politicians about the limits of, their actions under international law, because most of them will actually just invoke that. They will either say it will violate international law if we claim jurisdiction over this case, or they will claim, well, production will simply move outside. And this is really problematic both from an animal law or animals perspective, because they're not regulated at all. And it's problematic from a democratic perspective because many citizens actually want stronger and more effective animal laws, yet their states are not pushing through precisely because of those economic dimensions or because of the claim that international law forbids them from acting.
Right, so once you get past that hurdle, once you educate, right, the populations that you can do this,
Yeah.
right, what's the obstacle to actually doing it? Is it going to be a lack of will, or, well, simply animal abuse does not rise to the level of these other categories like sex trafficking or piracy? Or is it going to be some other reason? What are the real tangible obstacles to getting animal protection included in that right now, very special basket of areas in which states regulate outside their borders?
Yeah, that's a good question. I believe two steps are necessary for this. One is to actually also educate the public as a whole about the effects of our actions on animals. While we may not think that our actions against animals are as bad as, for example, human trafficking, if you ask the animals, this situation might be judged by them very differently. So it's not just about I mean, of course, law is a tool for humans to, regulate their own social, economic environment. But if we think about all others, we might, want to push further and think about how our actions affect them and how it feels for them. And the second point, I think, which is a real obstacle, is that many states actually believe they have some of the highest standards in the world. So if any state is against outsourcing because they claim, it will move abroad and then animals will be slaughtered without any laws applying to them. They will be raised in conditions where there are no laws at all, even though themselves do not have like a critical engagement of what they do to animals, and an understanding that most of the laws that we have right now are not actually about protecting animals, but protecting our use of animals. So I think a real obstacle is getting states and the public to confront that reality.
Okay, so you raised the idea that there could be negative consequences along the lines of some of the words that you used are culture of imperialism and neo-colonialism. So let's take an example of a country, a hypothetical country that has the best standards anywhere in the world. And that country decides to really embrace this extraterritorial jurisdiction idea and impose its laws everywhere it sees a violation. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? What are the costs and benefits of that kind of action? Could it have unintended negative consequences?
Oh yeah, many negative consequences. So maybe to put a bracket before that. So a state applying its laws anywhere in the world is practically unknown.
Right.
So I put on safety measures and requirements for the universality principle. So usually under international law, the requirement is that there is a reasonable link to the state.
Sure.
And that the state does not apply the laws kind of with ulterior motives of subjugating minority groups, for example. But this can be difficult to prove. We have to look at, debates in parliament, etc., to actually verify the reasons for which this is done. Then I believe the main clashes or obstacles that can emerge is that we only apply punctually to people on other territory while not doing the same. So for example, it's quite likely that a state feels like, we have to do this when it comes to, so one example is, I believe Belgium or the Netherlands actually had brothels with animals that were legal for quite some time. And they actually led to almost like a sex tourism when it came to animal and international sex tourism. So in a sense, we could say, let's just apply our laws extraterritorially to all those nationals that visit those brothels, and then let's just do it with regard to dogs, for example, because we don't care about the cows, etc. We don't care about sheep. We don't care about factory farming, etc. So this can be seen as being very, very narrowly tied to the state's interests, not thinking about, and it could in effect, affect certain minority groups that feel oppressed. So I call for more consistency and coherence, both in terms of which animals are being covered, which actions are being covered, call for good faith application of using animal law across the border, but also, a really critical view of states when it comes to their own laws.
So thinking carefully about when are these laws applied, as we might want to happen in the current system. So you talk a lot about trade in the book, and could you give us an overview on trade law and animal law? You say for decades scholars have debated, is the World Trade Organization good for animals or not good for animals? Where does trade sit in all of this for you?
So when it comes to, the World Trade Organization has been immensely important for animal advocates on the international scale, because animals are still being seen as property, and as such they're widely traded. The World Trade Organization was kind of set up with the belief that liberalization of trade would bring about global welfare, wealth for individuals, jobs for people, increased GDP, etc. Right now there's like a lively debate on whether that has actually happened or not, but when it comes to animals and how trade has affected their interests, That's not discussed at all, and it doesn't factor into their judgment of whether WTO law has overall been useful or not. But when we look at trade or the effects of trade from the animal law perspective, it's been extremely problematic. So animal law usually sets up regulatory requirements, and those regulatory requirements usually limit trade flows. So generally, animal law and trade law are seen as being at odds with one another. And so in the book, I take several steps to actually dispel this myth. Shall I talk more about how to do this?
Do you want to talk about one of the cases you think best exemplifies that trade law can be protective?
So, yeah, maybe not. It's more from a conceptual perspective, but can be applied to numerous cases. So when we go back to the indirect extraterritorial jurisdiction, most states that are affected by trade bans say, well, the other states simply want to tell us what we should do and how we should produce animals. So they basically claim that this is a form of direct extraterritorial jurisdiction. Direct would mean that it regulates content extraterritorially. That would be this part.
So it's saying if you want to sell your eggs here, they have to be cage-free.
Yeah, that would be a trade ban, right? But people say, well, you tell us right now how we should, raise hens, whether we should use battery cages or free-range methods. So what I show is that it's not actually about regulating content extraterritorially, but those laws actually regulate content territorially. So most of the trade bans are in fact about protecting people from being exposed to products that they deem abhorrent. It's not actually about telling other states or producers in those states what to do with the animals, because after all, with the trade ban in place, the producers can decide, how to react to the trade ban. They can move their production to a different country and sell it there. They can, abide by those requirements and continue to export to that country, but they're not bound by it.
Well, on a small scale, that's the Massachusetts law now as well. If you want to sell here, here's what you have to accomplish.
Yeah, but you're not obliged.
You're not
to
obliged
sell
to sell here, exactly.
So that's an important element. And then, of course, looking at ways in which products are alike or unlike under WTO, or justifications under public morals, animal welfare, or ways to protect natural resources.
Okay. So I want to ask a few more questions and let everyone else here ask questions as well. One thing you hint at, and it's a question I've always thought a lot about, is should animals take on a sort of a citizenship of their country of origin? That is to say, when Australia puts hundreds of thousands of sheep on a boat and sends them to the Middle East, should they carry with them the protection that they had under Australian law? It's the question you're asking here, but I'm sort of putting an animal right in front and center, in the sense that does Australia have a right to expect that they would be treated as they would be at home? A right to even put that in the shipping requirements? Or is that too invasive, right? Is that getting at questions of multiculturalism and respect for minorities? And here, of course, we're talking about halal slaughter, which would be potentially a slaughter that does not meet the standards of Australian law. Should we think about animals as citizens, traveling around the world and carrying a passport and the protection that comes with it?
So this is a very good question, and I believe too that there are limits to just seeing animals as property that are regulated through the nationality of their property holders, for example. So you can just move ownership and then actually evade jurisdiction as well. So in the book, I looked at whether animals could be directly subject to jurisdiction as being goods, as being hybrid legal subjects, but then I also turned to what I call functional nationality. So think of ships, for example, that ship the high seas. They're not nationals in the strict sense of a state, but they do move under the flag nationality principle. And this is de facto nationality that is used under international law. And I personally do support claims for citizenship for animals following like Donaldson and Kimlicott, Oakley's, etc. But I believe even just for the cases of, sticking to the status quo, it's easy to set up at least for some states, to set up de facto nationality for animals. Many animals do have pet passports, there's horse passports, etc. They carry the emblem of the states. There's like a description, looks exactly like a human passport in many states. So this can be used as an indication of de facto nationality. When it comes to the case that you just mentioned, Australia, I think there's a real paradox or problem here that, to the extent that if Australia were to set up de facto nationality for the sheep who are being moved abroad, for example, claiming that they should be slaughtered in a certain way or that they should be treated in a certain way, then I think the conflict arises, does Australia actually want to really export these animals or not? The conflict between, are we okay with, making lots of profit from the exploitation of these animals, or are we not? And this is, I feel like, an ongoing conflict that could culminate at this intersection.
So last question I ask you, you expressed skepticism about treaties, that international treaty could be a solution. And I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on human rights treaties. And oftentimes they are aspirational. They do seek to bring countries up to the level in the treaty as opposed to starting from the lowest common denominator. Your take on animal treaties tended to assume we would get a lowest common denominator treaty, and that's worse than nothing. Is the human rights treaty body system at all a model that we might aspire to?
In an ideal world, I think, at least from a critical animal perspective, I feel like this would be something that could fundamentally further the plight of animals. I think it would be very useful to have robust rights for animals, ways to actually have them access remedies, etc. So that would be very important. My assumption that we will converge toward the lower common denominator is that if we look at, so as I mentioned, there are no international treaties in force that currently do protect animals in this, as individuals, as bearers of interests. But there are proposals like the International Convention on Animal Protection, the Universal Declaration of Animal Welfare, but they're very, very lax. And for most states that have high levels of animal protection, they would not be useful. In fact, they would, bring down their levels of animal welfare, so it would in fact be counterproductive. Then there's proposals like the Declaration of Animal Rights, which is far more aspirational, more into the direction of the human rights treaties. And I think those could theoretically be useful. And it's still important to, in addition to looking at ways to protect animals extraterritorially, to pursue the route of having an aspirational, or having at least a conversation about aspirational treaties for animals.
And of course, as we know, we only have the human rights treaties because of World War II and the horrific events that prompted, the world to sit down and say, how can that not happen again? And maybe we haven't had any kind of confrontational moment like that for animals. So I want to take your questions and see where you want to follow up on any of these things with MH. Okay, great. I know some of you
Please
are
wait for the
outside,
microphone
so
because we're recording.
a good time to move out.
Thank you for this talk, Professor Stilt and Charlotte. So this picks up a little bit on Professor Stilt, your point about what would it take to convince, say, a legislator in the U.S. to adopt this kind of framework. And when I was thinking about your question, I thought, well, what are the reasons why we have the domestic animal rights protections that we have now? And could you convince, first of all, I think that in a large part, they're a response to the public's sentiments and feelings about this issue. And my question is about sort of, do you get a sense that the public has some idea, some distinction that they have between like our animals and their animals, and whether, or like animals outside outside their own country, and whether or not the argument would be sort of animal welfare is not an issue that is constrained by boundaries, because in some sense animals and animal welfare is an issue that crosses over boundaries. And so that's the first part of the question. So that requires a sense that animals are kind of belong to the world, in a way. But my understanding of jurisdiction is that a central basis for exercising jurisdiction is nexus. So here, you might have this opposite idea that in order to protect animals, there has to be some idea that they're ours, as opposed to, not ours. And I guess this question is a little bit layered, but which of those ideas, if they're true, can help your project?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I believe it's like it has two sides to it, and finding the right, middle line in between will be very difficult. On the one hand, I believe viewing animals as ours can be very conducive, especially as animals are literally relocated from one state to another. This was the case when it comes, for example, to the horses that were exported to Mexico. But then on the other hand, it can literally go into the direction of being really negative, because all the US cares about is their horses, while not actually looking at the ways in which those horses have been treated in the context of the US, for example. And it can be used to actually oppress, Mexican ways of using animals. And so I think there's like two aspects to this. One can be really dangerous nationalistic tendencies when it comes to animals and ways in which, others are being oppressed. And on the other hand, like having a truly genuine connection to animals that are seen as, de facto nationals, quasi-citizens, however you want to call this. I think it's, so the book does try to provide a lot of at least working solutions, but I think its main goal is to actually have this conversation and hopefully also to have it not only on a global scale, but within each country and kind of debate those ideas. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, this goes not so much to the geography of the regulation, but to the type of regulation. So would it be more effective to have prohibitions over certain things, or to have market solutions for regulating them? I mean, I'm thinking about Cecil the lion, for example. Does it make sense to prohibit hunting, or does it make sense to sell licenses and fuel the money back into the community? Like, what nature should these regulations be?
Good question. I believe they're in line with the human rights regime that has established or much more expertise and experience when it comes to the extraterritorial dimensions. There's now consensus in the human rights regime that there needs to be a smart mix between regulations and kind of market-based mechanisms. So we have now talked about this, but there's also an entire chapter in the book that deals with so-called extended forms of extraterritorial jurisdiction, be it investment rules, export credit regulations, CSR, code of conduct, OECD recommendations for multinationals, etc. So kind of more subtle forms of extraterritorial jurisdiction, but they can, in certain circumstances, be actually more effective. Think of investment rules that, kick in before a project is actually being set up abroad.
I think the challenge is that in the human rights world, we have a consensus that there are human rights, and we're starting from really no consensus in terms of what are we even talking about. So the challenge is even greater in that sense.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, thank you for this talk. It's been giving me a lot to think about. And I was wondering about the substantial effects point. And, if the state wants to enforce extraterritorial jurisdiction and it's not on one of their own nationals, you're saying that it could still enforce it as long as there's substantial effect. But I'm wondering, does there have to be then a market for those products, these animal products, in the country that's enforcing it? And if so, then is there the same limitation that an import ban would have, where an actor, if they don't want to, comply with those regulations, they can just stop selling to that market. So is that the only way to have substantial effect? Or are there other means?
Yeah, substantial effects on what? I mean, that's a good
Exactly.
clarifying
Yeah.
starting
Yeah.
point.
So usually the substantial effects have been seen as having a substantial effect on market. Antitrust laws, for example, that do distort the market in another country, for example, have been seen as giving rise to the right of states to apply the laws across the border. But the effects principles is now also applied in other areas. For example, when it comes to labor law protections, there have been a few cases where the effects principle has been applied, or even environmental effects. And here the boundaries between the different jurisdictional principles begin to blur, because we also have the protective principle. I haven't talked about this today, but the protective principle would also, for example, empower states to, for example, regulate concentrated animal feeding operations abroad if they have an effect on their environment, a substantial one. That would be another case. And yeah.
What's the labor example? Can you tell us what that is?
It was a case, I think also Bush versus, I can't remember exactly, but it was a case in the US where basically labor standards, low labor standards abroad, did have a negative effect on the labor market within the US. And there were claims that this could be applied extraterritorially. I think this case was denied, but there are other examples that I talk about in other jurisdictions where on a legislative basis that was established.
Questions?
As people are thinking, can I ask you a follow-up? Oh, no, we got one, okay.
Well, this isn't to do so much with this kind of trade, but there are, I think many countries, most have some regulations on animals coming in, whether they're pets or maybe they're breeders of even things like cats, where some of them cost thousands of dollars. And in quarantines, like in England, I understand there's a very long quarantine on pet type animals. I don't know how they define it, but so it seems that there's some agreement in a way, even though it's not done internationally, that individual states, countries do have some notion of health in the animals and so forth. So it seems like there could be, a way to start with that, something like that, and then escalate it into, the huge amounts of slaughter and so forth.
Very good point. I think that ties to one of the questions that you had also wanted to ask about the OIE and the connection between animal welfare and animal health.
Right, well, I think to this point, right, there's no question that states, of course there may be trade barrier issues, can regulate what's coming in, right, with their own health or safety or standards, et cetera. But on the health question, some of you may have heard of the World Animal Health Organization, or World Organization for Animal Health, which is the really only international organization that has animal welfare anywhere in its ambit. And it's not really high up. It's part of it in the sense that welfare leads to better health is the theory, but that's the only place in the world where these kind of conversations have been had. But I don't think you're super enthusiastic about this organization becoming the home of animal welfare standards around the world. That's how I read your take on it.
Well, there are different reasons for that, and you're correct in thinking that I don't believe that this is a very fruitful way going forward. Technically, like the OIE agreements covering animal welfare could
It's also called the OIE, it's the French.
yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Could technically operate as a means to set up more robust protections for animals. But mostly the OIE's treaties are in the form of recommendations, so they're not binding. The way in which those standards are set can be problematic from a democratic point of view. But most of all, so there's another dimension to that, and that is the OIE's role in the context of trade. So usually you can, it's more easy for a state to ban importation of certain products by saying, international standards setter, OIE, forbids that animals be treated this and that way, so we're not allowing those imports to take place. The problem is that the WTO has recognized the OIE only as a standard setter when it comes to animal health, but not when it comes to animal welfare. And animal welfare only became a mandate of the OIE after this agreement took place between the WTO and the UN. So this is a point of ongoing contestation. And then also, not only from a legal perspective, but also from a scientific perspective, like where does animal health start? Where do we move into the sphere of animal welfare? Because some of these are really, intertwined.
Any other questions?
Thank you both. I'm curious if you've thought through what mechanism or what role labeling could play in animal products and bringing increased transparency. I know in this country there's been a lot of debate back and forth about country of origin labeling for meat products, but I'm wondering if there could be an additional role for a country that wants to shed some light on transparency. So I'm not sure exactly what it would look like, but raised in Australia, slaughtered in Indonesia, or something like that, for packaged animal products. If that would add some level of transparency to consumer choice, or if there are negative implications of that.
Yeah, labeling is something that I do cover in the book as part of the WTO law. I'm skeptical about labels for a number of reasons. I believe that many labels are misleading, and some court cases in Australia, for example, are showing that right now. So they can be very deceptive. For example, when it says free range on a package of eggs, what does it mean? Does it mean you have like 20 square meters of ranging free as an animal? Do you get to do this 5 minutes a day or 24 hours? Is it, with thousands of animals in the same room, and how much can you freely range then? So there's kind of an element in which people's good intentions are being exploited as those products are being sold. And I believe most people are now buying products as they go through the store and thinking, oh, I'm sure that's not good standards by which it was produced. In fact, they don't even want to think about these dimensions, because they think about, preparing dinner for their family, or, culinary pleasures, etc. The second dimension is that I've looked at some of the empirical studies around labeling, and what I've seen was that it was mainly price that is decisive for consumer choice. So regardless of whether you have labels or not, most consumers simply go by price, even those that actually advocate for better protections for animals. So I'm not a strong advocate for labels, but I do set out some ways in which this could be strengthened in international trade law.
I was wondering if you've had a chance to look at maybe a convention like CITES, like a convention on endangered species, which actually makes it enforceable, so states could potentially be sued if they don't necessarily enforce, let's say, the trade that happens in Appendix 1, if there is an Appendix 1 listing, and the state continues to impose trade sanctions, potentially even sue the state for inaction. So do you think that a convention of that sort for animal welfare is possible, where all the member countries are held responsible and could be enforced that way, either through trade sanction or litigation?
My view of CITES is a bit more critical, I believe. CITES is known not to be properly enforced. They're like ministry of authorities within each state that are bound to enforce CITES, but this is not taking place. And even if you don't, as a state, there's like more actions right now to hold states responsible who don't abide by the principles. But if a state does not feel, if a state feels attacked by this, it can simply withdraw from the treaty and then access it again later. The United Arab Emirates did that in 1988 and then did it again in 1990. So I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of CITES also because it's focusing on the dimensions of trade. It focuses on species rather than individual animals. So yeah, I'm not sure if I would use CITES as a role model for individual protections of animals, or rather turn to what Professor Stilt said, like look at more ambitious human rights treaties as possible ways to further or discuss options for international treaties.
Any other questions?
Can I just follow up on one thing you said? There's so much that's fantastic about your book and new and novel. And one chapter in particular, I've never seen anyone talk about this at all, which is the role of major international financial institutions and their investments in large agricultural properties and endeavors. And what role could they play? I'm assuming they don't play a very good role now. They don't impose much of the way of standards when they invest in, let's say, the development of a big factory farm in China. But that seems to be, like the International Finance Corporation, that seems to be a really potentially powerful way. Do you want to say a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I also believe that this is a topic that has been taking off in the past 5 years.
Yeah,
even,
very recent.
Yeah, very recent. So international organizations are increasingly setting up investment principles that also. So usually they would consider only environmental principles, and here that only indirectly links to animals. For example, environmental pollution caused by concentrated animal feeding operations. But now they're setting up animal welfare principles. So the IFC has a set of recommendations that deal with animal welfare. They also have a good note on animal welfare, good practice note on animal welfare. The problem is, as I see it, this has so far mainly served for the IFC to, have a good image from a public perception basis. But when it comes to actually pushing and pulling through those commitments, that's not in place. So when we look at the numbers of the IFC, it still funds major CAFOs, like huge facilities in Ukraine, Bulgaria, China, that actually do produce some of the biggest CAFOs. And so is there a way to hold the IFC accountable for that? That's
Is there, has there been efforts to try to, because it sounds like the text of the language is not bad, but the implementation is lacking.
Yeah, so
that's a great project.
Yeah, there is definitely implementation that is lacking. So what's been done is, for example, the FAIR initiative is now it's a consulting organization that helps corporations themselves, not the IFC, to actually, accredit them for their investment practices and actually not just the commitment, but how it actually plays out in practice. That's a way to hold corporations accountable who do operate under the IFC. But as far as I'm concerned or informed, I don't know of any mechanism to hold the IFC itself accountable apart from calling it out in public.
Okay, anything else? Go ahead.
Thanks for coming in. At the end of the talk, Professor Stilt pointed out that the horrors of World War II forced the world to reckon with the sorts of injustices to which some individuals can subject others. My concern is that there seems to be a general understanding of the horrors to which animals are subjected, and yet there is pervasive apathy. I don't mean to understate the gains that have been made by people who try to shine a light on what's occurring, and yet it still seems to be the case that whatever sympathy or empathy is felt for humans who go through atrocities, that same level of empathy or sympathy is not there for animals. Professor Stilt said we're starting at square one, or we're just trying to get things moving because where people are in this room is pretty far removed from where much of the world is. Where do you begin?
Maybe the analogy isn't apt. Maybe there doesn't have to be one cataclysmic event, right? One, maybe it is just this slow-moving change over time. Maybe global warming will be the impetus. I don't know. I don't mean to answer the question, but I just think we have to recognize when we look at the human rights model that the world didn't just come to those conclusions preemptively. Right? Something really horrific happened. That is a slightly simplistic version, but something prompted those conversations. And does there need to be that prompt, and what would it be? So I don't know, how do you think about those questions?
No, I totally agree with what you said. Maybe something I could add in terms of what I feel like could be conducive to kind of make us as a society, but also on a political level, be more aware of what we do to animals, is to simply give them a voice. And I believe we don't do that right now. We're not very often listening to what animals have to say to us, even though they resist in, manifold ways. We're just not listening to those ways of resistance. We're basically silencing them. So I believe a way to kind of bring this into the conversation is having animal language be discussed on a political level, ways in which we can translate what they think and feel. And Eva Mayer, for example, she just published a book with NYU Press that came out 1 or 2 weeks ago. She's a fantastic scholar in that respect, and I think that is, that is
What's
work
the book called?
Animal Languages, and there's a subtitle on, I think, political communication.
But your point, I think, was that we know what we need to know, and yet there's no action. Is that in part what you were saying?
I wonder whether that's the case. Sometimes it seems that the animal welfare organizations are intent primarily on obtaining footage from slaughterhouses to get the message out that horrors are occurring. Sometimes it seems that people do know, but the impetus to change that we would imagine that to be, it isn't. But maybe it's the case that we're just in a progressive Cambridge bubble and people generally don't know actually what's going on in slaughterhouses. I'm sure this is something you have researched. But
Oh yeah, I mean, there's different ways to tackle that, and I think having a conversation about this, not silencing it, increasing our empathy through main education, for example, too. I think there's not one solution to this problem. I don't believe that, and it will depend on the cultural context within each nation and even locally. So I would, I always advocate for multidimensional efforts to actually, bring about the conversation. In some countries, some means have been very effective, and others have. So this is a part of an ongoing exploration, I think.
I'll just add my own personal sense is that we don't know enough about what people think and how they shift beliefs. And I think social psychology has not been a field that's been really well integrated into the animal protection movements. But I think as more social psychologists come in and start to ask these kinds of questions, maybe we'll get more answers.
But recently, there's been a huge amount of corporate investment in plant-based foods, and this isn't, it's a big thing. It's not just a few people at a co-op or something, but when these corporations, including places like Burger King and things, are doing that, so people try them, and there's a much greater awareness. It doesn't mean that they will act, but and then translate it into looking at these international issues.
These huge shifts that Charlotte's
But
talking about.
I do think there's no question that that's a big thing now.
I think there was maybe a last question back here, Chris.
Can I quickly respond to that? I believe this is a fantastic development, and part of me wants to believe that at some point it might be able to displace, the consumption of animals. But when I look to, I've recently read a piece by Vasila Stănescu, who, uses a critical lens on this, looking back at how the rise of organic products was also thought to displace, cattle-produced products, and it did not. It just, was meant to live friendly next to the cattle product. So, I want to see too, like more empirical studies actually showing how we can displace animal products through these alternatives.
Just a follow-up. Across different countries, how much change do you see? Do you think that is altruistic, like people who are making change on behalf of animals because they feel guilty or they want to make change for the animals, versus like a public health concern, a race to the bottom leads to like pigs crowding, and that causes problems in science and health issues? How much of the changes do you see across countries is from a place of wanting to help the animals versus wanting to help us?
Ooh, that is a difficult question, and it totally depends. Are we talking politicians, individuals, corporations? What does most interest you most?
Well, I don't know how much of the change is being driven
That, again, I would be cautious to kind of generalize these claims. I think it totally depends. You know, as I mentioned before, there's cow protections in India that are not even about cows. They're not about protecting them, but they're mostly about, you know, making a statement, claiming a nationality or kind of a certain stance and excluding others. Then there are truly altruistic motives. Then there are moves that, for example, you know, climate protests right now have had a huge effect on certain politicians and legislators. In other states, politicians have been totally resilient and not listening to climate protests. So, yeah, I don't know. I think it would totally depend on the context, the type of, you know, measure that is being proposed. Yeah.
I'll just add that in the research I've done, mainly in the Muslim world, where there's a very strong religious support for animal welfare, and if you ask people, what does this verse mean, or what does this mean? Does this mean that animals should be protected for themselves? The answer is absolutely. But when you try to figure out what actually causes movement and change, it's public health. It's not abstract concern. And there's also, you know, varying levels of consumer awareness. You know, Kelly was asking about labels. Well, in these meat markets, there's no labels. Like, they're just carcasses hanging, you know, on a hook. And so consumers don't think to ask these kinds of questions because there's an infrastructure that talks about different kinds of choices and what might they mean. So I don't need to have a grim ending, but you know, there are countries with much higher level of consumer awareness and transparency and knowledge than others, when people are just trying to get, you know, a few grams of meat for the daily stew and get home as quick as possible, and aren't in a position where the government, which controls, in many countries, the government controls the way things are labeled or not labeled or presented. There's just no information, there's no conversation to start with.
And maybe to add, we're like, many countries are also not democracies in the sense that individuals could actually influence the debate on a public level, apart from, you know, protesting. So, yeah.
Do you have time for one last one? Sure. Oh, actually, there's someone in the back. So two last ones.
I was wondering if, this might be a little bit off topic, but if you've thought about how far, or if you have an opinion about how far off you think we are from having a substitute for meat that is, you know, that is better for building muscle and more nutritious and that tastes better and is less expensive. Because to me, once that happens, just naturally, the slaughterhouses are going to shut down.
You're talking about cellular agriculture or cultured meat? Is that what you're talking about?
Any meat substitute.
Meat substitute. I think we've got some pretty good ones right now. Right?
Something that's superior in every way.
Well, you may have to wait for the cultured meat to come to market, but that's not that far off. I mean, our own clinic, and Gabe, you might want to say something about that. Our own clinic, or Kelly, you're here too, is actively talking to the American regulators about how quickly that might happen. You want to weigh in? You want to give us a date by which we can purchase cultured meat?
I don't have a date. I don't think anyone has one. I know that there are a couple of companies now that are claiming to be ready to, or ready in the next year or two, to bring their products to market and are only waiting on a regulatory pathway. I'll caveat to say that any products being brought to market within the next couple of years, if it happens that quickly, will be on a very, very small scale and then be very, very expensive, we anticipate. But this is technology that companies are making big promises about their ability to scale and eventually make it cost competitive. I think another important point is that one of the time delays is that regulatory pathway, but we have heard that USDA is in the process of drafting regulations that would allow these products to be brought to market. So we don't know how fast that will happen. We're working to push them to make that happen a little bit faster and in a common sense way.
Great, excellent. All right, so now we're on our last question with Emily. Okay, go ahead. You're fine.
Well, I guess just
just on a more general note about sort of just like the idea that, well, everybody knows and no one cares, kind of. I mean, I'm sorry to reduce the comment to that, but, or just that, is it a matter of knowing or is it a matter of caring? Maybe is a good way to put it. I just want to maybe like mention that, you know, knowing something is not a closed or discrete act. Like the way the politics are now, you can see like we can all look at one thing, can know the facts of something, and see totally different things. And I think what's going on here with the program and with scholars and thinkers is that what really matters is the lens by which you look at something. And that you can look at one thing one time in one place and you can see one thing, but through developing lenses, different lenses for looking at the same thing, you can see something totally different. And it's not like atrocities, you know, just began in the last century. You know, it's how we see them that changes, and I think that's the work, is to change how we see things.
Great.
Yeah.
It's a great way to end. Yeah.
Maybe just two
Wrap it up.
points
Yeah.
to add
Wrap
to
it up,
this.
Charlotte.
Like some states have, Austria, for example, has a duty that it puts on the government to actually inform the public about all matters of animal law, how our actions affect them, etc. So I think that would be a good starting point, to not just put it on the shoulders of activists to do all that work and come up with the funds to do it, but to oblige governments to do that. And then one thing that I'm not a huge fan of Peter Singer, unlike other people in this room, but he said he has an article that he wrote on developing and practicing empathy towards animals, and I think he's totally right in saying this is like a muscle. And so far, you know, when we're from kindergarten onwards, we're not taught, you know, skill-based knowledge in terms of how are we empathetic with others? How do we create solidarity with others? What does it mean to be the other? And all of this, I think that should be, you know, an important part of education going forward. And in an ideal world, this would be, you know, part of school curriculum.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Charlotte, for this magnificent book. Really good book.
So maybe just to add, there are 2 copies on the desk for anyone who wants to see them, and the book is available on open access and free of cost. So you go to Global OUP, you can, this is just a short video showing you that, you can download the PDF free of cost. So anyone who's interested in looking at it.